Hey everybody, welcome back to Tim Travels. I'm Terry, your host. It's February 24th, the 24th day of Black History Month. And it's a Saturday night. It's actually exactly 1900. My trainee Logan and I have picked up a load from Mountain Air over in Millsboro, Delaware, and we're headed west, going out to Kansas. My wife is, she's still on the mend, but she's back on her feet, so that's cool. And she was like, yeah. Actually, we wanted to get on the road yesterday. There was, some issues with getting people loads or whatever, so we got a load. We're headed out west, and then the plan is to get back to Springfield so Logan can take his CDL exam. But in the meantime, we stopped at a Royal Farms here, and I bought him the best convenience store fried chicken in the world, according to Food and Wine magazine, and he was kind of like really wanted to get some fried chicken anyway, so he gave it a 2 thumbs up. And now, right now, I think he's up in the bunk sleeping it off. But so I wanted to talk about a few things we're doing. So we came across the Bay Bridge from I was gonna say mainland Maryland, but it's not the mainland. But we came across the Bay Bridge, across the Chesapeake Bay, to what people commonly refer to as the Eastern Shore of Maryland. And when I was going through the Eastern Shore, I was thinking of that the Eastern Shore is the birthplace of probably 2 of the most influential and famous people to ever be enslaved in the United States. One is Harriet Tubman. She was born in Dorchester County, Maryland in 1822. And Dorchester County, for those of you kind of keeping score at home, if you ever driven out US 50 towards Ocean City, it's Cambridge, Maryland is the county seat. So it's the biggest town in the county, but we just know she was born in Dorchester County. Frederick Douglass was born in a little town called Cordova that's still there. That's in Talbot County. And just to give you an idea, Talbot County it's going to be like if you were heading from, say, Annapolis out to the ocean, it would be the second county you'd come to when you cross the bay. The first would be Queen Anne's, but Talbot County is the next county you'd probably come to, and that is the Easton, Maryland is the county seat of Talbot County. And I know all these county seats for a number of reasons, but mostly because I used to go to court in all these towns. So even the smallest county, which is actually Kent County, Maryland, I think there's maybe like 16,000 people in the whole county. But all these counties, both way out in the western, out in the mountains, like out to Cumberland and beyond, Garrett County, Maryland, I used to go to all these county seats because that's where all the courthouses are. And I've appeared in court in every single county in Maryland. So, and I'm sure I'm not unique. I mean, I know lots of lawyers that would be on the road all the time. So anyway, and so I was thinking about Tubman and Douglass, but I wanted to talk today not about persons so much, famous African Americans or famous, black people, but I wanted to talk about about reparations. And I don't want anybody to get their panties in a twist, because a lot of times when you hear people say reparations, you think about paying money to holders, people that were held as slaves or their descendants. And a lot of people, and I used to feel this way too, I'd be like, hey, look, my family, first of all, nobody in my family that I have any knowledge of held slaves. That's the first thing. The second thing is that a lot of my family members didn't even come to the United States until after the Civil War. We did have some folks that came during the potato famine in the 1840s, but a lot of my family also came like after the war, like in the 1880s. So, I often was like, well, why should I pay reparations and as a taxpayer or whatever, because I didn't really necessarily know the vehicle. But the answer to that question maybe is that we've already paid reparations when slaves were freed. It's just they were paid to slaveholders. Because remember I told you about a man named Armistead who actually had, even though the Marquis de Lafayette petitioned for his freedom, the Virginia legislature said, hey, we're going to pay his slave owner, even though he did exemplary service and very dangerous service because he was a double agent. He was a double agent, and he could have easily been executed if he'd have been caught because he wasn't a soldier. He wasn't given his freedom until a foreign national who was a hero here in the United States asked for it. And even then, the owner of him had to be compensated for it, even though he had basically provided valuable service to the fledgling United States. And so I started looking up, I don't even know why, but I heard something about reparations, and I was like, let me go back and look at this, right? And, so it was really surprising to me how reparations, and they called it compensation, but we can, the words don't necessarily matter, right? Compensation, damages is a word that you would hear in court. Reparations, repairing the damage, right? That's the root word. It's all the same thing, right? It's the idea that somebody had something of value, the government, and the idea was the government was taking that thing of value away. But what we often don't acknowledge that the government itself, but certainly thousands and thousands of individuals and their descendants benefited from chattel slavery. And so I looked first, I read this article about the District of Columbia Emancipation Act, and that was signed into law on April 16th of 1862 by President Lincoln. Now remember, the Emancipation Proclamation that basically freed slaves in the Confederate territories, that didn't go into effect until January 1st, 1863. But this was an act of taking place in the one jurisdiction that the federal government had control over, which was the District of Columbia. But Lincoln had floated this idea back when he was a congressman. But the thing is that they said, okay, but we're going to pay, the federal government was going to pay $300 per slave that was emancipated by their owners. And these had to be Union loyalist slaveholders. So yeah, that's a thing. There were people that didn't want the Union dissolved, and they weren't Confederate, supporters or sympathizers, but they still held slaves. A lot of them were just Union loyal because of circumstance, because they lived in the District of Columbia, they have businesses there. They couldn't really say, hey, I'm a Confederate, because they would probably have been locked up, and their slaves would have been taken with no recompense. So anyway, Lincoln authorizes up to $1 million. And just to give you an idea, in today's dollars, that would have been like $28-30 million just for just to be paid to slaveholders when we were on the road to outlawing slavery anyway. Because a lot of the Southerners, most Southern slaveholders did not get reparations. But, William Lloyd Garrison, who was a famous abolitionist, way back in 1833 at an abolitionist conference in Philadelphia, said this, and I'm quoting, "If compensation is to be given at all, it should be to the outraged and guiltless slaves, and not to those who have plundered and abused them." And end quote. And there were other proposals where it was like, well, we'll pay the slave owners and the enslaved. Those never went anywhere. And the government was worried, the U.S. government was worried about the takings, what is called the takings clause in the Fifth Amendment. And the Fifth Amendment says that the government can't take property without compensating somebody. That's why if the state wants to take part of your land to widen a highway, they got to compensate you for it, right? But we're talking about human beings. Now, in 1860, there were about 3.8 million slaves in the United States, not just in the South, in all of the United States. And keep that number in mind for a second. But here are some other countries that paid out huge amounts to slaveholders. England, who had abolished slavery years earlier, decades earlier, they paid like $26 million to 46,000 slaveholders. So in 2021 dollars, that would be like $350 billion that they paid. In fact, they had to borrow money from the Rothschilds. Keep that name in your head because it's going to come up again. By the way, the Rothschilds are one of the richest families in the world and have been for centuries. And then France demanded, so the Haitians, all the people living in Haiti, in 1804, they demanded their independence. But it wasn't until 1825 that the King of France said, okay, we'll recognize your independence, but you have to pay us for your freedom. And that amount was 150 million French francs. And at the time, that was 10 years of GDP, gross domestic product, of Haiti. So the Haitians had to borrow money to pay the French. They borrowed money and then they paid it back over time. But guess who they borrowed it from? A bank that was owned by, among others, the Rothschilds. It took them, wrap your head around this for a second. It took from 1825 until 1947 for the Haitians to fully pay off that debt. There were 7,900 slaveholders that were going to be compensated. But the French did all the genealogical work. And so even after those slaveholders and slaves, former slaves, had died, Haiti was still paying the descendants of these original slaveholders. So this was a multi-generational, slap in the face to the nation of Haiti. And because nobody that was enslaved in 1800 was still alive in 1947, nor was anybody that wasn't an enslaver. But the payments still continued to their descendants. And, I told you that there were about, close to 4 million, 3.5 to 4 million slaves in the United States in 1860. There's a sociologist at the University of Connecticut that estimated that from the time the United States was a country to when slaves were finally emancipated in 1865, the value of slave labor in 2021 dollars is about $20 trillion, which, by the way, is about a year of GDP of the United States. So knowing all this and knowing that people generations after slavery was abolished continued to make money off the institution of slavery, it kind of begs the question. And by the way, that $20 trillion, that's about the wealth gap between the average black person and the average white person. So what I mean is that not between 1 and 1, but when you look at the communities, right? That's about the wealth gap in terms of property ownership, investments, retirement accounts, etc. That's about the wealth gap. And it's kind of interesting, right? It's like all this labor was done. And let's be candid. If you go to almost any town that has houses, especially in the South, but oftentimes other places, including Washington, D.C., right? If you go to any town in the South, for example, where there's a house older than 1865, I guarantee that house was built with slave labor. It would be shocking that it wasn't. Now, maybe there was some dude out in the frontier part of the South, like Josie Wales, who just built his own log cabin. Sure. But if you see houses that are still standing today, like if you go down in the Battery in Charleston, for example, or you go to towns that have been around for a long, long time in the South, the odds are, like, I've been to the Confederate White House. Do you really think that the Confederate States of America paid for that place to be built? And I don't know, maybe that was already in existence before the war and they just turned in the Confederate White House. But I guarantee it was built, in whole or in part with slave labor. And, that, and here's the other thing about, even though Southerners didn't get reparations for, having their slaves taken away, the money that they made, these people were rich when the war started, and sure, they suffered losses, but I mean, think about it, right? Sherman comes through Georgia and burns your house down, but you didn't pay to have that house built other than maybe buying the lumber. But it might be that house that would have been in today's dollars like a $3 million home. It costs you almost nothing other than, you had people cut down trees on your land. But the people that cut the trees down, the people that sawed the lumber, that milled things, that built things, that painted things, that hauled stones for foundations, it was all slaves. I mean, yeah, there were white overseers, white carpenters, but the vast majority of that work, that labor was costing you nothing or almost nothing because you had enslaved people. And those slaves were parceled out to other people for labor. So even if a slaveholder didn't have a huge cropland that needed to be handled by slaves, he was still loaning them out like they were a tool and getting compensated for it. So when we think about reparations, I think it would behoove us as a nation to just be really honest about this and say, hey, we know where the money went. Because the interesting thing is, we know who owned slaves in 1860. And I could trace those people to the people that are alive today. And in a lot of cases, you're going to find people that they were wealthy in 1860, and that wealth was created by the institution of slavery and its implementation, and that wealth carried over generationally. Conversely, poverty has carried over generationally in a lot of black families. They started out poor, meaning they had nothing. And then even when they got their freedom, all their work and all their labor you know, it's like, I can't imagine working for 20 years and having $0, owning nothing, having $0, right? And yet, you know, a lot of people will be like, oh, well, people are poor, you know, it's their fault, they just don't want to work. But just like there's generational wealth, you know, there's generational poverty. And generational wealth in this country a lot of times has been the cause of generational poverty when you understand the systems that have been in place for generations, for centuries. So anyway, I still got a few days left of Black History Month, but I wanted to share those ideas and those facts about who got rich even when they had to give up their slaves. So anyway, a couple of trucking things. The FMCSA wants to see your lease. So if you're leasing with a trucking company, the FMCSA is interested in seeing your lease. And it doesn't matter whether you think your lease is a bad lease or you're getting taken advantage of. Although I feel like a lot of people that are in bad leases really don't understand the extent of it. But also if you have a good lease, if you're like, hey, you know, I think my company treats me fairly, that I'm contracted with, I don't have a terrible situation, they've never hidden the ball, they've never tricked me, whatever I was supposed to get, I got. That's a good lease, right? Not saying it's a great deal for you, but there's a difference between it being a great deal for you and it being fair. You know, a lot of people say fair means pari passu, everybody makes the same thing, but that's not really true. The notion of fairness is honesty and forthrightness. If you sign a deal to buy a property that for $200,000 that's only worth $100,000 and nobody tricked you into that, you just did it, that's still a fair deal. Not saying it's a good deal for you, but it's a fair deal. So anyway, the FMCSA wants to look at that. And by the way, I've had a few people reach out to me about the new rules, the new Department of Labor rules that are going into, well, scheduled to go into effect next month, about independent contractors. And you know, somebody said something to me the other day, and I don't know exactly what company they were working for, but they said that they have to get permission. Like they're leasing a truck, but they're not like, and they were on a dedicated route with whoever they're contracting with, but they aren't allowed to take that truck anywhere but on the dedicated account. They can't take it on home time or anything like that. And I thought, that's really weird. That's really a lot of control for when you're leasing something. That's like, you know, General Motors, you know, Acceptance Corporation, GMAC, or, you know, Chrysler Motor Credit or Toyota Motor Finance or whatever, saying to somebody that leases a car, hey, you can drive this car from home to your office and back again, and you can go out to dinner twice a week in it, but that's it, right? Like that's not no one would sign a car lease like that. Why would you sign a truck lease like that? Why would you think that was okay? And so that's a lease I would say, yeah, show the FMCSA. The other thing that the FMCSA is getting ready to do is to launch a study along with the Office of Management and Budget, which is part of the White House. That's a White House position, right? That's a close agency, you know, working at the White House. But they are taking a look at detention and the impact it has on truck drivers. And I've never really been I've never been somebody that felt like I got screwed over on detention. More often than not, the companies I worked for, except probably, maybe not at night as much, because I didn't really, and at night we had a lot of dropping hooks. But I guess at Schugle, I probably got screwed out of detention a couple of times, even though I'm very certain the company got it from where I was detained. But like at GP Transco and here at Prime, I've never thought that I wasn't getting treated fairly when it came to detention, by and large. And I'll be candid with you, I'm not the best person to ask about it because I don't really check. Like, I saw my statement for this week, and I had like 2 detention entries that totaled up to around between $500 and $600. And one of them I was like, I thought I already got paid for that. And it was like from several weeks ago. So it was like a little bonus, you know. But the government's interested in that. And you know, you could say what you will about, you know, Joe Biden or his administration, but I can say with a lot of confidence that it really does seem like the Department of Transportation is trying to do positive things for truck drivers and for railroad workers and other people. They recognize the importance of the U.S. transportation system. They recognize the importance of each individual truck driver. And, you know, you could say, well, the FMCSA wants to do speed limiters, or they want everybody on electronic logs. I've already said this about those 2 things. People are like, oh, they're up in my grill. That's government overreach. My opinion is it's making things more competitive. The people that don't have to abide by any rules involving like electronic logs, they're getting a competitive advantage that I don't think they should have. Same thing with speed, you know, I mean, and really I don't care that much about speed, except to the extent that I think a lot of wrecks could be avoided if, you know, I see some spectacular wrecks on highways where the speed limits are really high, like Wyoming or Utah or whatever. And I just feel like, man, you know, if the speed limit was 100, there'd be truckers out there trying to do 100 up and down mountains. You know, I mean, a lot of people, you know, there's a saying that just because you can do something doesn't mean you should. But there's a lot of people that absolutely don't get that saying, you know. And, you know, I think it's just a public safety thing, and I include myself in the public. But when it comes to like detention and wanting to understand leases and stuff, these are all super pro trucker initiatives. Like, the only people that gotta sweat that type of shit are big companies, trucking companies, shippers, and receivers, but not people like us. So, you know, you take the good with the bad sometimes. You have to give a little to get a little. But here's the thing, if every trucker out here got detention, I feel like a lot of truckers would be like, I don't need to drive 85 miles an hour, because that 4 hours I spent, you know, where the lumpers took 4 hours to offload 8 pallets, I got paid for that. I don't have to like risk my life and other motorists' lives just to make a buck. I was making a buck while I was in my sleeper. And, you know, Lyle, my good friend Lyle, always talks about that. He's like, man, it's free money. Sure, you don't make as much in from detention as you do rolling down the road at 65 or 70 or 97, but it is compensation, and I'm very certain a lot of people don't get it. It wouldn't surprise me that a lot of these guys that are these fly-by-night owner-op companies don't get detention, or if they do, it's a pittance. So anyway, hopefully, you know, things are going to get better, and the market's, you know, going to continue to get better. I think it's going to take until, you know, probably July, August before a lot of people start seeing things that they really are happy about. But I feel like it's starting to shift. But anyway, if you got a crappy lease, or if you love your lease, submit it to the FMCSA. You just go to their website and you can just download it to them. And with any comments, you can even tell them what you think about it. You know, give them the doc, but tell them what you think about it. So Anyway, I will talk to you guys soon. Be safe.